SpaceX is not losing to another rocket company. SpaceX is losing to a country. That is the sentence nobody in the space industry wants to say out loud, and it is exactly where we are starting tonight, because everything you think you know about this rivalry is built on the wrong scoreboard. For years, the story was simple. Elon Musk builds rockets faster than anyone on Earth, reuses them more than anyone on Earth, and nobody, not Boeing, not the Europeans, not the Russians, could even get close. That story is still true, but while everyone was watching the launch pad, China was quietly building something SpaceX cannot buy, cannot patent, and cannot outwork with more engineers in a warehouse in Texas. China was building an entire industrial nervous system for space, funded by the state, coordinated across dozens of companies, and aimed directly at the two things that actually decide who controls orbit in the long run, which are manufacturing capacity and government backing. Let us start with the number that should genuinely surprise you. In the year 2025, China completed 97 orbital launches, a record for the country. That is not a typo, and it is not a small milestone. It represents a jump of roughly 35% from the 68 launches China managed just 1 year earlier in 2024. Now compare that to SpaceX, which flew 165 Falcon 9 missions in that same year, putting more than 3,000 Starlink satellites into orbit. So yes, on pure launch count, SpaceX is still winning, and winning by a wide margin, nearly 2-1. If this were only a race to see who lights more candles under a rocket, the conversation would already be over. But here is the twist, and this is the part almost nobody outside defense circles is talking about. United States Space Force leadership is not measuring China against SpaceX using launch counts. They are measuring China using a different word entirely, and that word is threat. Lieutenant General Douglas Scheiss, who commands United States Space Force's space, said publicly in September of 2025 that China is, in his words, definitely our biggest threat in space, and that China is building new capability at least monthly that puts American assets at risk. That is not a business analyst talking about market share. That is a 4-star military officer talking about national security. And when the people whose job is to worry about worst-case scenarios start using language like that, it tells you the real competition has already shifted away from who launches the most rockets and toward who controls the infrastructure of space itself. So who exactly is China's competitor to Starlink, and what are they actually building? There are two major constellations you need to understand, because they are not the same thing wearing two different logos. The first is called Guowang, which is state-owned and is targeting nearly 13,000 satellites, primarily for domestic and government use inside China. The second is called Qianfan, sometimes referred to as the G60 Starlink, built by Shanghai Spacecom, and it is targeting somewhere between 14,000 and 15,000 satellites, but with a very different mission. Qianfan is designed for export. It is already signing service agreements in Brazil, in Thailand, in Malaysia, and across several African nations, which means China is not just trying to serve its own population, it is trying to compete for the same international customers that Starlink currently dominates. Now let us put the current scoreboard in front of you, because the gap is still enormous, and being honest about that gap is what makes the rest of this story credible. As of the middle of 2026, Starlink has more than 10,400 operational satellites in orbit, serving millions of subscribers across the planet. Guowang, meanwhile, has somewhere around 168 to 180 satellites. Qianfan has roughly 200. Add them together, and China's combined constellation still represents only about 3 to 4% of what Starlink already has flying. If you stop the story right here, you would walk away thinking this whole China threat narrative is exaggerated. And that is exactly why we need to keep going. Because the real danger is not what China has already built. It is what China has already built the capacity to build. Here is the fact that should stop you cold. China currently operates more than 55 identified satellite factories, with 36 of them already fully operational. Combined, these factories have a theoretical production capacity of 7,360 satellites per year. Read that number again. 7,360 satellites a year in theoretical capacity alone. And yet, in all of 2025, China only actually launched around 371 satellites. That is an almost unbelievable gap between what China can manufacture and what China can currently get into orbit. It means the bottleneck is not factories. The bottleneck is rockets. And that single fact tells you exactly where this story is going next. Because if China solves the launch bottleneck, that factory capacity does not sit idle for long. This is where reusability becomes the real battlefield, and where SpaceX still holds a commanding lead. But perhaps not for as long as people assume. Falcon 9 boosters routinely fly 15 or more times each, something that used to sound like science fiction a decade ago. Starship, SpaceX's next-generation vehicle, has already demonstrated full-stack reusability, and the company is now targeting a system of 5 launch pads designed to push cadence toward toward more than one launch every single week. Meanwhile, China's state-owned launch giant CASC only just flew its first reusable variant of the Long March 12B rocket in June of 2026 and did not even attempt to recover the booster on that flight. CASC has announced plans to debut a 4-meter diameter reusable rocket in 2025 and a 5-meter diameter version in 2026. In other words, China is roughly where SpaceX was several years ago on reusability, and everyone in the industry knows it. But do not let that comfort you too much, because there is a U.S. Congressional Commission, the United States-China Economic and Security Review Commission, that released a report in 2025 warning that Chinese reusable launch technology could become competitive with SpaceX by the year 2030. That is not some fringe prediction, that is an official government assessment, and it lines up with something the Space Force's own Chief of Space Operations, General B. Chance Saltzman, has warned about publicly, that China's aggressive investment in reusable launch could eventually produce an inflection point where China actually overtakes American leadership in this domain. 4 years from now sounds like a long time, until you remember how quickly China went from 68 launches to 97 launches in a single year. Now, let us talk about cost, because this is where the real economic war is being fought, quietly, in spreadsheets nobody outside the industry ever sees. SpaceX's Falcon 9 currently launches payloads for roughly $2,940 to $3,000 per kilogram to low Earth orbit. Starship, once fully operational, is targeting a cost as low as $100 to $500 per kilogram, which would be an economic earthquake for the entire launch industry. China, on the other hand, is nowhere close to that yet. CAS Space's Legion 1 rocket currently costs around $6,900 per kilogram, and the company's stated goal is to bring that down to about $4,140 per kilogram with its next-generation Legion 2 vehicle. So on cost efficiency, SpaceX is not just ahead, it is playing an entirely different game, potentially 10 times cheaper once Starship matures. So if SpaceX so clearly leads in cadence, reusability, and cost, why do American defense officials sound so alarmed? The answer has nothing to do with commercial satellite internet and everything to do with what those satellites can actually see. China now has more than 1,189 satellites in orbit as of July of 2025, which represents a staggering 927% increase since 2015. Of those, more than 500 are believed to be dedicated to intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. Analysts describe this as part of a so-called kill chain, a network of space-based sensors designed to detect, track, and eventually target American ships, aircraft, and ground forces at greater distances than ever before. Bradley Bowman, a defense analyst at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, put it bluntly. If adversaries gain better space-based intelligence and targeting capability than the United States and take away that high ground, that is, in his words, very, very dangerous. And it does not stop at surveillance. China has now flown 4 reusable spaceplane missions, with the second and third missions each remaining in orbit for 9 months at a time. That is a capability the United States has not matched with a comparable vehicle since the retirement of the space shuttle. Combine that with China's growing arsenal of counter-space weapons, including anti-satellite systems, laser dazzlers, and electronic jammers, and you start to understand why military planners are not asking whether China can compete commercially with SpaceX. They are asking whether China can deny the United States access to space entirely during a future conflict. Behind all of this sits one force that explains everything else, and that force is money, moving at a scale most people cannot picture. China's commercial space investment surged from $340 million in 2015 to $3,810 million in 2025. Zoom out further, and China has poured more than $104 billion into civil, military, and commercial space programs over the past decade. This is not venture capital chasing a trend. This is a national government treating space the same way it treats semiconductors or shipbuilding, as a strategic industry too important to leave to market forces alone. Analysts call this civil-military fusion, a system where a satellite factory built to serve a state constellation can just as easily produce hardware for a military reconnaissance program, often within the very same facility. Here is a comparison to make that scale feel real. Imagine an entire industrial city built specifically to produce spacecraft, employing thousands of workers, running around around the clock, guided not by quarterly earnings calls but by 5-year national plans. Now imagine 55 of those cities scattered across China, each one capable of shipping satellites the way an auto plant ships sedans. That is not science fiction. 15 flagship smart factories and more than 500 so-called excellence-level artificial intelligence integrated manufacturing facilities already exist inside China as of 2025. One facility in Shanghai alone is targeting production of 1 satellite per day. SpaceX, for all its brilliance, is still fundamentally one company, run by one visionary, competing against what is functionally an entire nation-state acting as a single coordinated corporation. So here's the question worth sitting with, and honestly worth arguing about in the comments below. If China ever closes the gap on reusable rockets, even partially, and starts feeding that 7,000 satellite a year manufacturing capacity into orbit, does Starlink's massive current lead even matter anymore? Or does raw industrial capacity simply run over first mover advantage the way it has in solar panels, in batteries, and in electric vehicles? Because that is exactly the pattern China has used before in industry after industry. Let the West build the technology, then out-manufacture everyone at a scale nobody else can afford to match. To be fair to SpaceX, the company is not standing still while any of this unfolds. It has produced more than 600 Raptor engines, with its Raptor 3 variant already logging over 40,000 seconds of total runtime in testing. Starship completed 5 full-stack test flights in 2025 alone, with a 6th generation flight, referred to as Flight 12, using the version 3 vehicle planned for March of 2026. On the national security side, SpaceX has secured $733,500,000 in contracts under the National Security Space Launch Phase 3 program, covering 9 separate missions, and in May of 2026, the company landed a $4,160 million Space Force contract for space-based tracking. In other words, SpaceX is not just racing China on cost and cadence, it is actively wiring itself into the American national security apparatus the same way China has wired its own companies into the Chinese state. Which brings us to the honest verdict, the one that actually respects the evidence instead of chasing a clickbait headline. SpaceX is not losing today. Not on launch numbers, not on reusability, not on cost per kilogram, and not on the size of its operational constellation. But the nature of the competition has fundamentally changed underneath everyone's feet. This is no longer a story about who builds the better rocket engine. It is a story about who controls the entire vertical stack, from raw satellite manufacturing to launch cadence to government funding to military integration, sustained over the next 5 to 10 years without blinking. SpaceX currently wins nearly every individual technical category. China is quietly building the only kind of opponent capable of outlasting a technical lead, an opponent with unlimited patience, unlimited factory floor space, and a government treasury that does not answer to shareholders. This is not a story about who lands on the moon first, or who builds the flashiest rocket for a highlight reel. It is a story about who controls the pipes, the factories, the funding, and the orbit itself, decade after decade, quarter after quarter, without ever needing to win a single headline to keep winning the actual war. That is the real race of the 21st century, and most people watching this had no idea it was even happening until right now. So the next time you see a headline about a rocket landing perfectly on a drone ship or a new satellite constellation announcement, remember what is actually happening underneath that headline. A slow, methodical, industrial battle for who gets to define how humanity lives, communicates, and defends itself from orbit for the rest of this century. To make sure you are never caught off guard by what comes next in this industry, and in the garage of the future that all of this technology is quietly building toward, join us here at Driven to Distraction.